On an ordinary evening in Barron County, Wisconsin, the Closs household, consisting of James, Denise, and their 13-year-old daughter Jayme, settled in for what they believed would be a typical night. None of them could have anticipated that their home was under surveillance. In the depths of night, Jayme detected something unsettling. Headlights entering their driveway, mysteriously dimmed. While it wasn't uncommon for drivers to use their property to turn around, something about this particular instance triggered her instincts enough to wake her parents. As James Closs descended to investigate, fate took a devastating turn. Moments later, the stillness shattered with James's desperate shouts, followed by the deafening crack of gunfire. The family pet, overwhelmed by terror, scurried away to hide. Uncertain of her father's fate, Jayme and her mother Denise made a frantic dash to the downstairs bathroom, securing the door and attempting to create any barrier they could muster. Mother and daughter huddled together in the bathtub, their hearts racing as they listened to the intruder, concealed behind a black ski mask, methodically breaking into each room. Denise managed to contact emergency services, but the most horrifying moments were yet to unfold. The assailant breached the bathroom, violently separated Jayme from her mother's embrace, and demanded Denise retrieve adhesive tape. Under the shadow of imminent death, the intruder commanded Denise to restrain her daughter. Dissatisfied with the mother's trembling attempts, he seized the tape himself, binding Jayme with brutal efficiency. He wrapped the tape around her head, covering her mouth, secured her hands behind her back, and bound her ankles. Then, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, he forced Jayme to witness her mother's execution. Before Jayme could process the horror before her, she was dragged past her father's lifeless form in the hallway. The assailant thrust her into his vehicle's trunk, which had been deliberately modified to prevent escape. The emergency release mechanism had been removed and the interior light disabled. For approximately 120 minutes, Jayme remained confined in the pitch-black trunk while the vehicle traversed unknown roads. In a twist of bitter irony that would only be revealed months later, the car briefly stopped to yield to police vehicles racing toward her home. The entire assault lasted just 4 minutes, but it forever altered Jayme Closs's existence. In one devastating night, a teenager lost her family, her freedom, and her sense of security, marking the beginning of an 88-day ordeal in captivity. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to us. The first sounds that reached the Barron County 911 Emergency Center in the early hours of October 15, 2018, weren't words but muffled screams and confused noises. The call came in at 12:53 a.m., and within minutes, the first patrol cars were cutting through the darkness toward the Closs residence. What law enforcement discovered would forever change this peaceful Wisconsin county. The home's entrance had been violently breached, the impact marks revealing the intruder's brutality. James Closs lay near the doorway, his face devastated by a 12-gauge shotgun blast. A single spent shell casing near his feet would be one of the few pieces of evidence left behind. Following established search protocols, law enforcement officers proceeded through the residence with weapons drawn, discovering a second victim in the ground floor bathroom. Denise Closs had been executed with a point-blank shot to the head, her body positioned in a manner that suggested a desperate final attempt at protection. The mobile device used to contact emergency services lay discarded in the corridor, a haunting testament to her last desperate attempt to summon help. However, it was what investigators didn't find that sent immediate shockwaves through the department. 13-year-old Jayme Closs had vanished without a trace. The perpetrator's methodical nature was deeply disturbing to seasoned investigators. The crime scene was remarkably devoid of traditional forensic evidence. No usable fingerprints, no footprints, no blood spatter patterns, and no apparent DNA traces were discovered. It appeared as though a phantom had orchestrated this horrific invasion, executed 2 adults with clinical precision, and spirited away an adolescent, leaving virtually no investigative threads to follow. The only tangible pieces of physical evidence were the discharged shotgun shells and the structural damage inflicted during the forceful entry. A race against time commenced immediately. The Federal Bureau of Investigation swiftly integrated into the investigation, establishing a command center within the Sheriff's Department facilities. The first significant breakthrough emerged from surveillance footage captured by nearby security cameras. A sedan, potentially identified as either a crimson or obsidian Dodge Charger, was recorded departing the vicinity precisely as law enforcement vehicles converged on the scene. The vehicle had momentarily halted to allow passage to the responding officers, a cruel twist of fate that would only be fully comprehended in the months that followed. The community's response was unprecedented in its scope and dedication. An initial search operation assembled 80 community volunteers, but it was the second mobilization that truly demonstrated the remarkable unity of the local population. More than 2,000 individuals formed an extensive search line, meticulously examining every square foot of the surrounding terrain. While unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with thermal imaging technology surveyed from above, specialized K-9 units methodically investigated the ground below, searching for any indication of Jayme's whereabouts. The Federal Bureau of Investigation promptly offered a $25,000 reward for actionable information, an amount that was immediately matched by the Genio Turkey store, where both James and Denise had been employed. The investigation center began receiving an overwhelming volume of tips, reported sightings at various service stations, accounts of suspicious vehicles, and numerous theories regarding the crime. Each piece of information required thorough verification, consuming precious investigative resources and manpower. A minor breakthrough occurred when forensic technicians successfully recovered a partial DNA sequence from one of the discharged shotgun shells. While insufficient for definitive identification purposes, this genetic profile would prove valuable for excluding potential suspects and confirming possible matches. Law enforcement initiated an extensive DNA collection campaign, gathering voluntary samples from local residents and individuals with documented criminal histories in the surrounding region. Investigators methodically eliminated various theories regarding the crime. Some speculation centered on Jayme's potential involvement, but this was quickly dismissed as she had no access to firearms, and the external damage to the entry points contradicted any possibility of internal participation. Analysis of her mobile device revealed no suspicious communications or clandestine relationships. Her closest connection appeared to be with her mother, Denise. As a final precautionary measure, surveillance equipment was discreetly installed around the Closs property perimeter. Investigators hoped the perpetrator might return to the crime scene, a behavioral pattern documented in similar cases. While this strategic decision didn't lead to the capture of the assailant, it would result in an unexpected discovery in the weeks that followed, introducing another layer of complexity to an already intricate investigation. In the midst of one of Wisconsin's most extensive criminal investigations, a persistent question haunted investigators. How could someone execute such a brutal crime with such precision, leaving virtually no significant forensic evidence? The answer, when it finally emerged, would prove even more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. This level of sophistication suggested a perpetrator who had carefully planned every detail, raising concerns about the possibility of similar incidents in the future. The morning dawned with a promising development in the case that had held Barron County in suspense for weeks. The surveillance cameras strategically positioned around the Closs residence had captured footage that caused investigators' pulse rates to quicken. An unauthorized individual had entered the premises. After weeks of frustrating dead ends, it appeared they finally had a concrete lead to pursue in their investigation. Law enforcement response to the surveillance footage was swift and precisely coordinated. Multiple patrol vehicles converged on the location with tactical precision, maintaining radio silence to preserve the element of surprise. Officers, weapons at the ready, methodically approached the Closs residence, which still bore the haunting physical evidence of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls mere weeks before. Inside the dwelling, they encountered Kyle Jankianis, whose very presence in this location, considered sacred ground by the tight-knit community, was deeply troubling. However, the situation escalated to an entirely different level of concern when officers discovered the contents of his pockets, personal effects belonging to the Closs family, including 2 sets of undergarments identified as belonging to Jayme. The discovery triggered an immediate cascade of investigative activity throughout the law enforcement facility. The interrogation room was meticulously prepared. Recording equipment was thoroughly tested and calibrated, and senior investigators were summoned from their various assignments. As news of the arrest spread through the community, residents collectively held their breath, wondering if this development would finally provide the breakthrough they had been desperately hoping for in this devastating case that had shaken their peaceful county to its very foundations. The formal interrogation process commenced precisely at 15:47 hours. From the very beginning, seasoned investigators noticed something distinctly peculiar about Kyle's nonverbal communication patterns. His physical comportment presented a fascinating study in calculated discomfort. He positioned himself as far from the interrogation table as physically possible, a behavioral pattern that specialists in nonverbal communication typically associate with individuals attempting to establish psychological distance from a situation, rather than those actively concealing information about a specific criminal act. The suspect maintained his lower extremities tightly tucked beneath his seating arrangement, a classic self-protective gesture, while keeping his fingers interlocked at chest level, a traditionally defensive posture that behaviorists often interpret as a subconscious attempt to create a barrier between oneself and perceived threats. The investigators, extensively trained in interpreting such subtle behavioral indicators, quickly recognized that they were dealing with an individual who appeared more focused on constructing an elaborate narrative than concealing specific details about the crime in question. The initial inquiry was straightforward and direct. What motivated your presence in the residence? Kyle's response initiated what would become one of the most bizarrely fascinating interrogation sessions in the department's recorded history. To be perfectly honest with you, I had developed this theory about potential staging, he began, his vocal patterns alternating between conspiratorial undertones and self-proclaimed enlightenment. I possess certain heightened sensory capabilities that aren't common among the general population. I'm often able to perceive things beyond normal human perception, which is directly connected to my territorial associations and spatial awareness. Throughout the subsequent 3-hour interrogation, investigators witnessed an extraordinary display of verbal evasion that seemed to defy conventional logic and rational thought processes. Kyle demonstrated a remarkable ability to transform even the most straightforward queries into elaborate, meandering monologues that ultimately led nowhere meaningful. When pressed specifically about his unusual interest in the Closs investigation, his response manifested as a verbal labyrinth. Why does it matter? Because we're dealing with a missing adolescent. Why does that particular aspect resonate with me? When you consider the implications for a child, his responses would then invariably dissolve into seemingly endless tangential discussions. The most surreal segment of the interrogation emerged when investigators directly addressed the personal items discovered in his possession. Kyle's explanation regarding the undergarments evolved into what could only be described as an improvisational theatrical performance. His initial narrative completely denied any intentional removal of the items from the premises. Within minutes, this transformed into an elaborate tale about his philanthropic intentions to donate the clothing to disadvantaged youth, which subsequently metamorphosed into a lengthy dissertation about his ambitious plans to establish a comprehensive homeless shelter program. The investigators observed with professional interest as Kyle constructed increasingly complex layers of explanation, each more elaborate than its predecessor. When confronted with obvious inconsistencies in his narrative, he would simply introduce additional layers of complexity to his story, much like an artist continuing to apply new layers of paint to cover imperfections, ultimately creating an increasingly incomprehensible masterpiece of confusion and misdirection. The most unexpected development occurred when Kyle introduced his third variation of the undergarment narrative. At this point, he suddenly claimed the items were intended for his personal use, connecting them to a previously unmentioned gender transition process. Got to address transgender considerations, he declared abruptly, before making an inexplicable logical leap to hate crime statistics, leaving even the most experienced investigators struggling to follow his rapidly evolving narrative threads. Behavioral specialists present during the interrogation identified a fascinating psychological pattern. Kyle appeared to be living within his own carefully constructed reality, casting himself in the role of an enigmatic detective possessing supernatural abilities. His communication style, characterized by alternating between cryptic statements and dramatic revelations, suggested someone more invested in creating an atmosphere of mystery than in actually solving the case at hand. The most revealing moment of the extensive interrogation process occurred when the investigators abandoned their nuanced approach and posed a direct, unambiguous question regarding any potential knowledge about Jayme's whereabouts or involvement in the homicides. Kyle's response proved remarkably noteworthy not for its content, but for its unprecedented clarity. "No, I do not." This represented the singular instance throughout the entire 3-hour interview where he provided a straightforward response without embarking on elaborate tangential discussions or alternative theoretical frameworks. This stark departure from his established communication pattern caught the attention of the behavioral analysts monitoring the session. The investigative team subsequently dedicated multiple comprehensive days to conducting an exhaustive background investigation of Kyle, meticulously examining his interpersonal connections, thoroughly analyzing every statement made during the interrogation, and systematically reconstructing his activities leading up to the incident. The department enlisted the expertise of specialized body language analysts and forensic psychologists to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of his behavioral patterns and responses throughout the recorded session. After extensive deliberation and analysis, the unanimous professional consensus emerged. Despite Kyle's deeply troubling behavior and unauthorized entry into the property, there existed no substantive connection between him and either Jayme's disappearance or the tragic deaths of her parents. This peculiar episode served as a poignant reflection of the immense pressure weighing upon the investigation. Each false lead thoroughly investigated, each potential suspect methodically eliminated from consideration, simultaneously intensified the frustration experienced by the investigative team and deepened the collective anxiety permeating the community. While Kyle Jankianis faced legal consequences for unauthorized entry and theft, the true resolution to the mysterious disappearance of Jayme Closs remained tantalizingly elusive, awaiting a development that no one could have reasonably anticipated or predicted. Within the peaceful confines of Eau Claire Acres, an outwardly unremarkable residential structure concealed one of Wisconsin's most disturbing secrets. For an agonizing period of 88 days, this seemingly ordinary house, which blended seamlessly into its suburban surroundings, functioned as an improvised detention facility for Jayme Closs. The residence, continuously occupied by her captor, occasionally received visits from his father, who remained completely unaware that a forcibly detained adolescent shared the same living space during his periodic stays. The implementation of confinement demonstrated both simplicity and psychological sophistication. Jayme was systematically forced to conceal herself beneath her captor's bed, a claustrophobic space deliberately configured for long-term captivity. The abductor had ingeniously engineered an improvised containment system. Strategically positioned heavy-duty plastic storage containers and weight training equipment were carefully arranged around the perimeter of the bed, creating an effectively impenetrable physical barrier that rendered her presence virtually undetectable to casual observation. The conditions of her confinement manifested unprecedented levels of inhumanity. The confined space beneath the bed frame was extraordinarily restrictive and cluttered, forcing Jayme to remain essentially immobilized for extended periods frequently exceeding 12 consecutive hours. During these prolonged intervals of isolation, she was systematically denied access to fundamental human necessities. Sustenance, hydration, and basic sanitary facilities remained completely inaccessible. The overwhelming silence became her sole companion throughout these interminable hours of solitary confinement. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this horrific situation lay in the fact that, for the majority of her captivity, Jayme remained physically unrestrained by conventional means. The residential doors weren't consistently secured, yet her captor maintained absolute control through something far more powerful than physical restraints or mechanical locks: sophisticated psychological manipulation and sustained emotional terrorism. He had successfully established such an effective regime of persistent fear that verbal commands alone proved sufficient to ensure her complete compliance when he needed to leave the premises. The periodic visits from the perpetrator's father to the residence revealed the calculated nature of the captivity arrangement. During these occasions, Jayme was compelled to maintain absolute stillness in her improvised hiding place, while everyday conversations transpired mere inches above her position. Patrick, the father, made numerous visits to the residence throughout the 88-day ordeal, remaining completely oblivious to the fact that a kidnapped teenager was concealed within his son's bedroom. From his perspective, the house served exclusively as his son's private residence. The psychological control mechanisms employed against Jayme demonstrated remarkable sophistication and calculation. During the initial phase of captivity, the abductor established behavioral parameters through explicit death threats conditional upon any form of disobedience. As time progressed, although he verbally retracted the direct death threats, he maintained a persistent state of psychological intimidation by frequently emphasizing that any act of disobedience would result in him becoming extremely angry. The unspoken reminder of her parents' tragic fate lingered ominously behind every veiled threat. The daily routine within the improvised prison exhibited surreal elements that stood in stark contrast to the fundamentally violent nature of the situation. The captor attempted to construct a distorted semblance of normalcy through forced participation in board game activities. In particularly disturbing attempts to establish some form of dysfunctional bond, he offered Jayme both marijuana and vodka, substances which she consistently refused despite the psychological pressure. The level of information control exercised over Jayme demonstrated exceptional calculation and forethought. Whenever television broadcasts featured coverage of her disappearance, the device was immediately deactivated. The perpetrator recognized that any exposure to ongoing search efforts or investigative developments might potentially inspire hope in his captive, possibly encouraging attempts at escape. The residence within Eau Claire Acres manifested as a parallel dimension where conventional temporal progression appeared suspended in perpetual stasis. Throughout daylight hours, when not confined beneath the bed, Jayme was systematically compelled to participate in her captor's meticulously orchestrated routines, activities he appeared to conceptualize as mechanisms for normalizing their fundamentally aberrant situation. As darkness descended, with the singular exception of the initial night when he occupied the living room sofa, she was forced to share his bed, an extraordinarily disturbing component of her captivity that exemplified the perpetrator's complete psychological dominance over his victim's autonomy and personal boundaries. The implementation of isolation protocols achieved near-total effectiveness. Throughout the 88 days of involuntary confinement, Jayme experienced absolute disconnection from external communication channels. Telecommunication devices remained inaccessible, internet connectivity was systematically restricted, and interaction with any individuals beyond her captor was categorically prohibited. Beyond the physical boundaries of the residential structure, society continued its regular progression, while within those walls, time appeared permanently suspended within an interminable nightmare scenario. The remarkable effectiveness of the psychological control mechanisms implemented against Jayme was evidenced by her captor's subsequent statement that literally zero resistance occurred until her eventual escape. The omnipresent specter of fear had evolved into a tangible presence, manifesting as concretely as the structural walls that maintained her physical isolation from civilization. Every audible footstep, every perceptible creak of the floorboards, every moment of oppressive silence carried the substantial weight of implicit threats originating from that catastrophic October evening. In a particularly disturbing demonstration of the perpetrator's attempt to maintain an illusion of normalcy, he periodically entertained visitors within the residence throughout Jayme's captivity. During each of these social interactions, she remained confined within her improvised hiding space, compelled to regulate even her respiratory functions to maintain absolute silence, while casual conversations transpired in immediate proximity. The jarring juxtaposition between the ordinary social interactions occurring mere inches away and her forced isolation amplified the psychological torment of her confinement. The space beneath the bed transcended its physical characteristics as a mere location of confinement. It manifested as a liminal space suspended between two distinct realities. Above, the superficial appearance of ordinary life proceeded without interruption. Below, an adolescent engaged in a continuous psychological battle to preserve her mental stability, methodically tracking the passage of time in complete silence, existing under the perpetual threat emanating from the individual who had systematically destroyed her family unit and forcibly appropriated her fundamental human rights. The morning of January 10, 2019, marked the beginning of a transformative sequence of events in the snow-covered landscape of Wisconsin. Within the rural expanse of Eau Claire Acres, Jean Nutter engaged in her routine canine exercise routine, entirely unaware that she would momentarily become an integral component in the resolution of one of the state's most distressing criminal investigations. Through the dense accumulation of winter precipitation, Nutter's visual field registered an incongruous element within the winter landscape. A solitary young female traversed the terrain, notably underdressed for the severe meteorological conditions, wearing only a hooded sleeveless garment and form-fitting athletic pants. Her footwear, significantly oversized for her physical dimensions, displayed reverse placement, the right shoe adorning the left foot and vice versa, suggesting rapid, desperate deployment in circumstances of extreme urgency. The physical condition of the young individual presented immediate cause for concern. Her hair exhibited extreme dishevelment, with visible tangled masses concentrated in the posterior region, indicating extended periods without proper grooming maintenance. Exhaustion manifested prominently in her facial features, and her ocular expression suggested psychological trauma. Before Nutter could initiate verbal inquiry, the young female rapidly approached and delivered a statement that effectively suspended temporal progression. She identified herself as Jayme Closs. Communicating with palpable urgency, Jayme explained her geographical disorientation but expressed desperate determination to return to her residence. She indicated a nearby structural dwelling, identifying it as her location of involuntary confinement. She reported her captor's temporary absence but expressed uncertainty regarding the duration of his departure. The temporal factor assumed critical importance in the developing situation. Nutter's professional instincts from her extensive experience in child protective services immediately activated. She implemented rapid decision-making protocols, recognizing the paramount importance of avoiding unnecessary interrogation. Her protective instincts assumed primary control over the situation. Understanding the imminent possibility of the perpetrator's return, she strategically decided against transporting Jayme to her own residence, which maintained dangerous proximity to the location of captivity. Instead, she formulated a plan to seek assistance at a more distant location. The journey towards safety evolved into an exercise in tactical movement. Nutter established protective physical contact by positioning her arm around Jayme while maintaining constant surveillance of the roadway for approaching vehicles. Their initial attempt to secure assistance at a nearby residence proved unsuccessful due to lack of response, necessitating continued movement. To minimize exposure to potential observation, they implemented an alternative route through adjacent properties, maintaining strategic distance from the main thoroughfare. Upon reaching their ultimate destination, the Kosinskas' residence, they encountered Peter Kosinskas, who manifested visible confusion upon observing his neighbor accompanied by an unfamiliar adolescent. Following their admission into the dwelling through the posterior entrance, immediate priority shifted toward establishing communication with law enforcement authorities. While Jean and Peter initiated contact with emergency services, Kristen Kosinskas assumed responsibility for providing psychological support and comfort to the visibly traumatized young survivor. The emergency communication process manifested extraordinary dramatic tension. Currently, I have a young individual in my residence who has identified herself as Jayme Closs. Jean informed the emergency operator, deliberately maintaining calm professionalism despite the gravity of the situation. When questioned regarding her familiarity with Jayme's widely circulated media photographs, Jan provided unequivocal confirmation of the identification without hesitation or uncertainty. The atmospheric tension within the Kosinskas' residence achieved palpable levels. Following strict procedural protocols, the emergency operator issued immediate instructions for comprehensive security measures, including the immediate securing of all entry points. Peter Kosinskas, implementing additional tactical security preparations, retrieved his 16-gauge hunting firearm and established a defensive position at the primary entrance. Should the perpetrator discover Jayme's location and attempt forcible recovery, he would encounter armed resistance from a determined defender. Throughout the 30-minute interval of heightened anticipation preceding law enforcement arrival, Jayme shared fragmented recollections of her harrowing experience with Jean. She described in precise detail the perpetrator's home invasion methodology, the execution of her parents, and her subsequent abduction. Her emphatic statement, "I had no prior knowledge of his existence," added another layer of disturbing complexity to the already horrifying narrative, underscoring the random nature of victim selection. The arrival of the initial law enforcement officer precipitated immediate tactical deployment. The officer instructed Peter to maintain his defensive position at the front entrance while establishing his own security position at the rear of the structure. The protection of the recovered victim assumed absolute priority in operational considerations. The emergency operator maintained continuous communication until receiving definitive confirmation of law enforcement presence within the residence. Jayme's evacuation from the Kosinska's residence proceeded under stringent security protocols. A female law enforcement officer assumed primary escort responsibility, with additional patrol vehicles providing comprehensive security coverage. In an extraordinary coincidence that referenced the October events, the evacuation convoy encountered a solitary vehicle traveling in the opposite direction, a dark red automobile, potentially identified as a Ford model. Law enforcement response demonstrated exceptional efficiency in establishing immediate roadblock positions surrounding the area of Jayme's captivity. Authorities implemented comprehensive measures to intercept the perpetrator should he attempt to return to the location. Operational priorities now encompass dual objectives: ensuring Jayme's continued safety and apprehending her abductor. Initial medical evaluation protocols necessitated transportation to the local medical facility. Despite the absence of immediately apparent physical injuries, comprehensive medical assessment proved essential following 88 days of captivity. Her clothing items were preserved as potential evidentiary material, symbolically marking the conclusion of her physical ordeal and the commencement of her recovery journey. Within the medical facility, Jayme's extraordinary psychological resilience became increasingly apparent. Despite experiencing unimaginable trauma, she demonstrated remarkable capacity for providing crucial investigative information to law enforcement authorities. Her mental clarity and determination would prove instrumental in subsequent developments. Information regarding Jayme's successful escape propagated rapidly throughout the Barron County community. Following 88 days of unsuccessful search operations, persistent prayers, and unwavering hope, their daughter of Barron had achieved safety. Her escape represented not merely personal liberation but initiated a healing process for an entire community profoundly affected by her absence. At the Eau Claire residence, law enforcement discovered that the property where Jayme experienced captivity belonged to Patrick Patterson, who demonstrated unexpected cooperation when contacted telephonically. Patrick explained his intermittent presence at the property, typically spending limited time periods or occasional overnight stays during weekends. During weekdays, he resided with his romantic partner to minimize his employment commute duration. The property remained under the exclusive occupation of his son, Jake Patterson, during remaining time periods. The suspect's identification unfolded with almost cinematic timing. As law enforcement conducted area surveillance, a red Ford approached the vicinity. Upon interception, the driver identified himself as Jake Thomas Patterson. Without prompting or interrogation, he provided an immediate confession that chilled even seasoned law enforcement officers. "I am responsible." Jake Thomas Patterson had reached 21 years of age when he executed the abduction of Jayme Closs. His historical background provided no obvious indicators of his capacity for such extreme violence. Following brief military service in the United States Navy, Jake received discharge due to unspecified medical conditions. His father, Patrick, revealed that this discharge significantly impacted his son's psychological state, initiating a period of evident difficulty in establishing life direction. Professional instability characterized his recent history. His final employment position at the Saputo cheese factory lasted merely 48 hours, an apparently insignificant detail that would later prove crucial in understanding the crime's origins. The interrogation process revealed disturbing levels of premeditation. Jake described 2 previous attempted abductions of Jayme prior to the successful assault. His initial attempt terminated due to excessive vehicles present at the Closs residence. 2 days subsequently, he initiated a second attempt but withdrew upon observing illuminated windows and evident family activity. The methodical nature of his crime planning demonstrated disturbing sophistication. Jake had calculated optimal timing, selecting Monday for the abduction to maximize his exclusive access to the Eau Claire residence before his father's anticipated weekend return. To minimize forensic evidence, he implemented extraordinary precautions. He completely removed facial and cranial hair to prevent biological trace evidence at the crime scene. He utilized double layers of hand protection and concealed his face with black ski equipment. His attention to forensic detail extended to sanitizing expended shotgun shells to eliminate identifying characteristics, although trace DNA unexpectedly survived his efforts. During comprehensive interrogation procedures, Jake provided temporal estimation indicating approximately 4 minutes total duration within the Closs residential structure. Demonstrating disturbingly precise memorial recall, he produced detailed diagrammatic representations indicating specific positioning of each family member and precise locations of lethal force application. The methodological analysis of the vehicle utilized in perpetrating the crime revealed additional layers of calculated premeditation. Jake confirmed his identity as the operator of the automobile that yielded to responding emergency vehicles on that fateful evening, with Jayme already confined within the concealed storage compartment. To complicate vehicle identification procedures, he had undertaken an elaborate journey to an alternate municipality to illegally obtain registration plates from an unidentified commercial transport vehicle. His tactical approach involved replacing exclusively the posterior registration identifier with the misappropriated plate while completely eliminating the anterior identification marker. Upon returning to his residence, he meticulously restored the original registration identifiers. The perpetrator's post-incident evidence management protocols demonstrated inconsistent patterns of forensic awareness. Jake implemented immediate incineration procedures for several incriminating items during the initial evening following the abduction. The specialized winter sports facial concealment equipment, Jayme's original clothing items, and the adhesive restraint materials. He provided alternative clothing from his personal inventory until acquiring new garments. However, his attention to forensic detail demonstrated peculiar lapses. The trousers worn during the commission of the crime remained among his soiled clothing items. The misappropriated vehicle registration plate maintained its position within a waste receptacle in the vehicular storage area, and unused ammunition components remained readily visible within the common living space. When investigators addressed these apparent inconsistencies in evidence management protocols, Jake provided a disturbingly pragmatic rationalization. He maintained the perspective that law enforcement discovery of his residence would inevitably result in locating Jayme, rendering additional evidence concealment efforts ultimately futile. Nevertheless, he recognized the necessity of eliminating immediately identifiable items, such as the facial concealment device and restraint materials, to prevent arousing suspicion during his father's periodic visits to the property. The most psychologically significant revelation during investigative procedures emerged when Jake disclosed his victim selection methodology. The initial identification occurred during a routine morning in October, approximately 14 days preceding the abduction, coinciding with his preliminary day of employment at the Saputo cheese manufacturing facility. Jake observed Jayme boarding educational transportation in proximity to her residence and, according to his direct testimony, experienced immediate certainty regarding his intended target for acquisition. Further psychological assessment revealed increasingly disturbing elements of his cognitive processes. Jake acknowledged persistent experience of anomalous psychological patterns and demonstrated awareness of their deviation from normative mental processes. Following his military service termination, he cultivated elaborate fantasies involving adolescent abduction scenarios. Although he claimed absence of specific tactical planning prior to observing Jayme, he had extensively contemplated theoretical methodology for such criminal activities. Within his distorted cognitive framework, residential invasion represented the exclusively viable approach to achieving his objectives. The arbitrary nature of Jayme's selection introduced additional elements of psychological terror to the investigation. Jake maintained no prior knowledge of her identity, demographic information, or familial connections until accessing media coverage of the homicides. The randomness of the initial observational contact, a momentary intersection of paths that irrevocably altered multiple life trajectories, amplified the horrifying implications of the crime. During investigative procedures, Jake demonstrated disturbing dissociation regarding the severity of his actions. He referenced his previous cognitive patterns as distinct entities separate from his core identity, while simultaneously attempting to rationalize his methodology as implementing appropriate procedural approaches. The cognitive dissonance became particularly apparent when he insisted he would never inflict intentional harm upon Jayme, demonstrating complete dissociation from the devastating psychological trauma he had already inflicted through his actions. The installation of structural barriers between Jake Patterson and standard incarceration protocols proved insufficient to prevent his attempts at establishing communication with Jayme Closs. Within 30 days following his detention, he orchestrated his initial communication attempt. His methodology demonstrated calculated approach, concealing personal correspondence intended for Jayme within seemingly innocuous communication addressed to his father, Patrick, anticipating facilitation of delivery through paternal intervention. Correctional facility security protocols functioned according to design parameters. All outgoing correspondence from Jake underwent comprehensive inspection procedures, resulting in successful interception of the unauthorized communication prior to reaching Patrick's possession. Specific content details remained classified by authorities, implementing protective measures to prevent additional psychological impact on Jayme. Experiencing frustration regarding his initial failed communication attempt, Jake identified alternative channels through media representatives. He established correspondence with journalistic professionals investigating his psychological motivations. Within these communications, his statements demonstrated significant correlation with initial law enforcement interrogation content. However, these exchanges revealed additional disturbing psychological elements previously undisclosed. Within the framework of this journalistic correspondence, Jake articulated a particularly revealing statement regarding his previous interactions with law enforcement authorities. I implemented deliberate strategic misrepresentation during investigative procedures to eliminate necessity for additional victim interviews, theoretically minimizing psychological impact. Nevertheless, authorities proceeded with victim questioning protocols, inadvertently amplifying psychological trauma without substantive justification. This communication demonstrated profound cognitive distortion, wherein the perpetrator conceptualized himself as a protective figure in relation to the individual he had systematically victimized through acts of extraordinary violence and psychological manipulation. The most noteworthy element within this correspondence manifested in an emphatically emphasized message produced in deliberately enlarged typographical representation. I extend profound regret regarding all actions affecting Jayme. Immediately following this declaration, utilizing standard calligraphic presentation, he supplemented, I maintain awareness regarding the limited significance of this expression. Unlike his initial unauthorized communication attempt, this correspondence successfully navigated institutional security protocols, ultimately reaching Jayme's extended family members. The family demonstrated remarkable dignity through their decision to maintain silence regarding the correspondence's specific contents. Following this communicative episode, Jake discontinued further attempts at establishing contact with Jayme. The subsequent significant development manifested through institutional recognition of Jayme's extraordinary courage. Wisconsin legislative representatives formally acknowledged her exceptional bravery through the presentation of her Community's Heroism Award, celebrating her remarkable demonstration of resilience in achieving liberation from involuntary confinement. The judicial proceedings achieved their most powerful moment during the presentation of Jayme's victim impact statement. Her words provided devastating testimony regarding the psychological devastation inflicted by Patterson. Jake Patterson has systematically eliminated numerous elements central to my existence. This reality generates profound psychological distress, particularly regarding the loss of my parental figures. My emotional connection to my mother and father maintained exceptional depth, matched by their reciprocal devotion. They implemented every conceivable measure to ensure my happiness and security. The profound psychological trauma became increasingly apparent through Jayme's description of the ongoing consequences. His actions resulted in their permanent removal from my existence. The methodology of their elimination generates persistent traumatic recollection. Contemporary requirements include residential security system installation to facilitate basic sleep functions. The cumulative impact exceeds reasonable psychological tolerance. Public interaction generates significant anxiety and apprehension. Nevertheless, her concluding statements demonstrated extraordinary psychological resilience. However, certain fundamental aspects remain beyond Jake Patterson's capacity for elimination. He maintains no authority over my fundamental liberty. His misconception regarding potential ownership of my person has been definitively disproven. The comprehensive impact of these proceedings culminated in Jake Thomas Patterson's judicial processing on May 24, 2019. He submitted guilty pleas regarding 2 charges of premeditated homicide in the first degree, resulting in institutional confinement for the duration of his natural life. Additional charges regarding involuntary detention supplemented his sentence with 25 years of additional incarceration. Significantly, the judicial authority mandated consecutive sentence implementation, effectively eliminating potential for conditional release consideration. During sentencing procedures, the presiding judicial authority delivered particularly impactful commentary reflecting community sentiment, characterizing Jake Patterson as representing the embodiment of malevolent intent. This determination guaranteed his permanent separation from society, while Jayme, having successfully re-established residence with extended family members and reunited with her companion animal, initiated the extensive process of psychological recovery and life reconstruction. The attempted communication through paternal intermediary, followed by journalistic correspondence, revealed disturbing behavioral patterns persisting beyond institutional confinement. These communications demonstrated persistent inability to fully comprehend the devastating impact of his actions, even when expressing superficial remorse. The contrast between his attempts at establishing communication and the impact described in Jayme's statement illustrated the profound disconnect between the perpetrator's distorted perception and the devastating reality experienced by his victim. While he sought various forms of psychological redemption through his correspondence, Jayme confronted daily psychological challenges, including the necessity for enhanced security measures simply to achieve basic sleep functions. The case involving Jayme Closs provided critical insights regarding identification of potential predatory individuals and the significance of community vigilance protocols. Behavioral analysis specialists identified multiple systematic patterns that, when observed in combination, may indicate potential threats to juvenile safety. The primary and most immediately apparent warning indicator manifests through excessive focus on specific juvenile subjects. In Patterson's case, this behavior demonstrated particularly disturbing characteristics when he identified Jayme through a single observational incident and immediately determined her status as his intended target. This type of immediate, intense fixation should consistently generate significant concern among observers. Additional critical behavioral indicators manifest through systematic implementation of isolation protocols targeting potential victims. Patterson's methodology demonstrated extreme manifestation of this characteristic, not merely through physical separation of Jayme from her established social support networks via abduction, but through implementation of comprehensive isolation protocols throughout her involuntary confinement period. Within less dramatic contextual frameworks, isolation attempts may manifest through systematic efforts to separate juvenile subjects from established social circles or create exclusive interpersonal dynamics. These behavioral patterns frequently constitute preliminary stages in predatory methodology. The case involving Jayme Closs provided critical insights regarding identification of potential predatory individuals. Behavioral analysis specialists identified multiple systematic patterns that, when observed in combination, may indicate potential threats to juvenile safety. In Patterson's case, his immediate fixation on Jayme through a single observational incident demonstrated particularly disturbing characteristics, with this type of intense focus serving as a primary warning indicator. Patterson's methodology demonstrated extreme manifestation of isolation tactics, not merely through physical separation via abduction, but through implementation of comprehensive isolation protocols throughout her confinement. Within less dramatic contexts, similar isolation attempts may manifest through systematic efforts to separate juveniles from established social circles or create exclusive interpersonal dynamics. The investigation revealed significant correlation between predatory tendencies and difficulty maintaining age-appropriate relationships. Patterson's notable challenges with social connections and preference for isolation represented classic warning signs requiring attention from authorities. His attempts to establish a distorted form of relationship through forced activities and inappropriate offerings of substances demonstrated fundamental disregard for boundaries. The psychological resilience demonstrated through Jayme's successful escape and subsequent recovery offers profound inspiration for similar cases. Her demonstrated strength in achieving liberation despite overwhelming circumstances proves that even within darkest situations, human determination can prevail. Her narrative transcends mere cautionary status, providing powerful testimony regarding human capacity for survival. The complex implications of this case extended far beyond immediate impact, influencing fundamental community perception regarding security and interpersonal trust. The randomness of victim selection introduced additional layers of psychological disturbance, necessitating reevaluation of established security protocols and implementation of enhanced awareness programs. Forensic psychological analysis of Patterson's behavioral patterns revealed disturbing insights regarding predatory methodology development. His transition from generalized fantasy scenarios to specific tactical implementation demonstrated dangerous evolution of criminal intent. The apparent randomness of victim selection, triggered by momentary observation, suggested potentially higher frequency of similar predatory impulses within general population. The investigation's impact generated substantial modifications to law enforcement methodology regarding missing persons cases. Patterson's sophisticated evidence elimination protocols and ability to maintain apparent normalcy emphasized the importance of thorough investigation of seemingly routine situations. His psychological manipulation tactics and calculated planning necessitated development of enhanced detection and prevention protocols. The media coverage revealed complex ethical considerations regarding balance between public awareness and victim privacy protection. The extensive coverage maintained crucial role in maintaining public engagement with investigation, while creating potential complications regarding prosecution. This dynamic led to reconsideration of information dissemination protocols during active investigations. The institutional ramifications precipitated comprehensive reevaluation of established procedures across multiple jurisdictional frameworks, particularly regarding simultaneous homicide and abduction scenarios. Patterson's sophisticated approach necessitated fundamental reconsideration of traditional search parameters and investigative assumptions. The case's impact continues to influence development of enhanced protection measures and intervention protocols across various institutions. Let me know in the comments which part of this story impacted you the most. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.